Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. In this video, we're taking a look at the process of gluconeogenesis. This is the production of glucose in the liver to be able to feed the rest of the body during times of fasting. So 6 to 8 hours between meals or even more. And we're creating this glucose from non-carbohydrate based sources, meaning proteins and fats. Let's take a look. So to begin, let's orientate ourselves first of all. We are basing this in a hepatocyte. So this is a liver cell and we've got the mitochondria here. So this is obviously the cytosol. And what I've drawn up here is glycolysis and then pyruvate entering the mitochondria, turning to acetyl-CoA, and then some important aspects of the Krebs cycle that are important in gluconeogenesis. Before we can talk about what happens when we're fasting, how do we make that glucose during times of not eating, we need to talk about very quickly, to set the scene, what happens after we've eaten, what we call the fed state. So let's just say we've got the bloodstream, you've just eaten a delicious meal, and what you find is that after that meal, you've got high blood glucose levels, and that triggers the pancreas to release insulin. So you've also got high blood insulin levels. Now, because we're talking about a hepatocyte here, that transporter, called a glucose transporter, a GLUT, that does not need insulin to bring that glucose in. So for the liver, glucose will simply diffuse down its concentration gradient to enter the liver. And that's an important point when it comes to gluconeogenesis. If we're talking about the muscle or fat, they need insulin for these transporters to work. They're called GLUT4 transporters, GLUT4. They need insulin. They won't work without insulin, meaning they won't bring glucose in. But the liver doesn't need insulin to bring glucose in. Your question might be, then why do we need insulin? Well, in the liver. Well, it's because insulin stimulates the enzymes of glycolysis and the Krebs cycle. So, but that's another video. So, glucose is high, it's entered the liver. That glucose turns to glucose 6-phosphate, which then turns to fructose 6-phosphate, turns to fructose 1,6-bisphosphate. Now that's a 6-carbon molecule, right? So it splits apart into two 3-carbon molecules, glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate and dihydroxyacetone phosphate, which then will turn to glyceraldehyde 3-phosphate. So we have two of those. Therefore, we have 2 1,3-bisphosphoglycerate, 2 of 3-phosphoglycerate, 2 of the phosphoglycerate, 2 of the phosphoenol pyruvate, and 2 pyruvate. Now, those 2 pyruvate will enter the mitochondria, turn into acetyl-CoA, and they will drive 2 cycles of the Krebs cycle. All right, so we've set the scene. What happens when we're fed? What's the whole point of this? The whole point of this is that in glycolysis, right, we're going to produce some ATP, and we're also going to produce something called NADH. I'll talk about that in a sec. Going from pyruvate to acetyl-CoA will also produce some NADH, and the Krebs cycle will also produce ATP, NADH, and something else called FADH2. So the whole purpose in the fed state of undergoing glycolysis in the Krebs cycle is to make ATP, NADH and FADH2. So in the fed state, we make energy. Brilliant. We also make these things and they're carrier molecules. They carry hydrogen, and we know hydrogen is made up of protons and electrons, specifically 1 proton, 1 electron. So NADH and FADH2 have plucked off hydrogens. Remember, glucose is C6H12O6. That's the chemical formula. By the time we get down to pyruvate, it's basically C6H8O6. So all that's happened is we've rearranged the molecule just for NADH and FADH2 to have stolen hydrogens. And they carry those hydrogens to the electron transport chain, where they give the electron transport chain the electrons and the protons, right? They dump off what they've just plucked off. And the electrons are sent across, they play hot potato with these electrons, and that stimulates some of these transport molecules. And what they do is it excites them to pump hydrogen into the intermembrane space of the mitochondria. And these hydrogen will move down their concentration gradient, down this final thing here called an ATP synthase, and that will spin this turbine to produce even more ATP. So what I'm telling you is that in the fed state, the whole purpose is to make, at the end of the day, just energy, ATP. But the thing is, once you've made enough ATP, but you've still got high blood glucose and the glucose is coming in, what happens is this thing that says, hey, don't make any more ATP. And it says stop, 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 stop. And what it effectively does is it tells that glucose, look, we don't need to make any more ATP, we need to be stored. So the glucose 6-phosphate actually gets stored as glycogen in the liver, right? So glycogen we can store, depending on the size of the person, we can store 100 grams and even more of glycogen in the liver. That's simply taking glucose, turning it to glucose 6-phosphate, gets changed again, but effectively stored as glycogen. Brilliant. So that's what happens in the fed state. We either make ATP or we store it for later use. Now let's say that we haven't eaten for 8 hours, right? We're between meals and we need some energy. So what happens is that the blood glucose levels will drop, unsurprisingly. So you got glucose levels dropping, which means your insulin levels will drop, but that stimulates your pancreas to release glucagon. Now, many students get mixed up between glucagon and glycogen. Remember, if it ends in OGEN, it means it's stored and inactive. So glycogen is the stored inactive form of glucose. Glucagon gets released when glucose is gone, right? When your blood glucose levels are low. So what's now happening? Well, now this is probably one of the most important points you must understand. One of the major goals of the liver when you are fasting, so meaning between meals, you haven't eaten, right? This could be you wake up from an overnight fast, so you've slept all night, right? Let's say it's 12 hours, you haven't eaten. Your blood glucose levels are low. The goal of the liver is to re-establish your normal blood glucose levels. That's it. It's not to make ATP. The liver doesn't think I need to make energy. The liver goes, I need to re-establish normal blood glucose levels. So everything we're going to talk about now with gluconeogenesis is to re-establish blood glucose levels. How many times do I need to say it? Okay, so you might think and go, how can the liver do it from what I've highlighted? Simple. Let's turn glycogen back into glucose 6-phosphate, back into glucose, and because the liver doesn't need insulin for glucose to come in and out, that glucose can just diffuse out down its concentration gradient. The problem, however, is this, that glycogen cannot just turn back into glucose 6-phosphate under normal conditions. And glucose 6-phosphate cannot just turn back into glucose under normal resting conditions. It's irreversible. But here's the thing. When you've got high levels of glucagon, so now everything I'm drawing in red is going to be stimulated by glucagon. Right? So, but when you've got high levels of glucagon, it allows for the enzymes to be produced that turn glycogen into glucose 6-phosphate. Those enzymes are called glycogen phosphorylase. Brilliant. So now we've turned glycogen into glucose 6-phosphate. Luckily, glucagon also stimulates the enzyme that can turn glucose 6-phosphate into glucose, and that's called glucose 6-phosphatase. It's called glucose 6-phosphatase. And now what we've done in the liver is we've turned glycogen to glucose 6-phosphate to glucose, and that free glucose can leave to help try and re-establish resting blood glucose levels. Brilliant. But there's a problem, and the problem is that we don't always have enough glycogen, especially if you continue to fast. So we're going to deplenish our glycogen levels. What do we do now? The liver still wants to try and re-establish normal resting blood glucose levels. So what do we do? Well, you could go, easy, let's just turn this whole thing in reverse. Let's just turn it in reverse. The goal is to make glucose. Well, if we turn it backwards, we'll make glucose. Well, if we had a look at that, what you're going to find is that some of the steps of the Krebs cycle are irreversible. So we can't really just turn the Krebs cycle backwards, right? Oxaloacetate, that can go backwards to malate. That's cool. But acetyl-CoA cannot turn backwards into pyruvate. And pyruvate cannot turn backwards into phosphoenol pyruvate. And we can't turn fructose 1,6-bisphosphate backwards into fructose 6-phosphate. So in actual fact, there's 3 steps of glycolysis that don't go backwards, right? So we can't just turn everything backwards. So what the liver does is it goes, okay, I know what to do. I know that what the muscle, so remember, outside of here, right? Our muscle and our red blood cells, they will produce lactate. Now you might be thinking, I thought lactate's only produced under anaerobic conditions when there's not enough oxygen. That's true, lactate will go higher, but lactate is always produced by these tissues. The liver always produces some amount of lactate, the muscle and the red blood cells always produce it. And so when they produce it in the fasting state, they go, what do I do with this? I'm just going to dump it off into the bloodstream. So that lactate will enter the bloodstream, and that lactate will end up making its way through to the liver, right? And what happens is that lactate, I'll draw it in red, that lactate can turn into pyruvate. And you go, okay, but we still can't turn the pyruvate back to make glucose. So what happens? This is what happens. This is important. That pyruvate goes, all right, I can't go back, so I'm just going to go forward. I'm going to enter the mitochondria, but I'm not going to turn into acetyl-CoA. I'm actually going to turn into oxaloacetate. It turns into oxaloacetate, and it does this using an enzyme called pyruvate carboxylase. Oxaloacetate, remember, can go backwards to malate. So it goes backwards to malate using an enzyme called malate dehydrogenase. Now here's the thing, malate leaves the mitochondria, and you might think, well, why didn't just oxaloacetate leave the mitochondria? We don't have transporters for oxaloacetate to leave, but we do for malate. So malate leaves the mitochondria, right? And then will turn back into oxaloacetate, and oxaloacetate will turn into phosphoenol pyruvate. Now, all of this happened just because pyruvate couldn't go back into phosphoenol pyruvate. This is the roundabout way. Now let's add the rest of the enzymes. Malate dehydrogenase was used to turn oxaloacetate to malate. It's also used to turn malate back to oxaloacetate. So let's just write MD for malate dehydrogenase. Now the enzyme used to turn oxaloacetate to phosphoenol pyruvate, that is called phosphoenol pyruvate carboxygenase. And again, what do you think stimulates these enzymes? Glucagon. Brilliant. So we've taken lactate in, turned it to pyruvate, entered the mitochondria, it's turned to oxaloacetate, turned to malate, that's legged it, left the mitochondria, turned into oxaloacetate again, which turned into phosphoenol pyruvate. Okay, so can we go backwards? Let's have a look. Well, yes, phosphoenol pyruvate can go backwards, and that 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 can go backwards, but we're stuck here, right? So what do we do? Well, luckily for us, glucagon can stimulate the transcription and translation of the enzyme that can turn fructose 1,6 bisphosphate to fructose 6-phosphate, and that enzyme is called fructose 1,6 bisphosphatase. And it goes backwards. And this step can go backwards, and luckily again, glucagon allowed for this to go backwards. What have we just done? We've just turned lactate into glucose. We've just turned a non-carbohydrate based source, because lactate is more amino acid based, into glucose. That is gluconeogenesis. I'm trying to find a place for us to be able to write this up. Maybe we can write it up here. We'll just write it up here. Okay, so we've got gluconeogenic substrates, right? Number one, lactate. Lactate is a very important gluconeogenic substrate. Let's take that word, Gluconeogenesis, right? Read it backwards. Genesis means the beginning of, neo means new, gluco means glucose. It's the beginning of new glucose. We are making glucose from non-carbohydrate based sources, amino acids and fats, and we just showed one of them. Importantly, really importantly, the only structure, the only organ undergoing gluconeogenesis is the liver, and that's going to be important shortly. All right, now, luckily for us, it's not only lactate that's being utilized here, we can use amino acids as well. And one really important one is alanine. And the reason why it's alanine is because alanine plays a really important role in helping us handle ammonia in what's called the Randall cycle or the alanine cycle. That's a future video. But alanine and amino acids can turn into pyruvate, same thing happening. So what's another important gluconeogenic substrate? Amino acids, such as alanine. Brilliant. Now, what else? Well, remember, we've got triglycerides. And during times of fasting, glucagon can help stimulate lipases. Lipases are enzymes that chop up triglycerides. So it goes to the adipose tissue, the fatty tissue, starts to chop up the triglycerides, right? So you've got, and I'll draw this way so I don't take up so much room. You've also got in adipose tissue, right, the release of fatty acids and glycerol. And the fatty acids and glycerol will also enter the liver. And what happens with the fatty acids and glycerol? Well, we've got the glycerol coming in, and we've got the fatty acids coming in. That glycerol can turn into dihydroxyacetone phosphate. Let's have a look. That, glucose. So glycerol is a gluconeogenic substrate. In actual fact, we've now just highlighted the three major sources for gluconeogenesis to make glucose to try and re-establish our resting blood glucose levels. Now, the problem with this is this, and this is an important point. When we turn pyruvate to oxaloacetate, that costs us energy in the form of ATP. When we turn oxaloacetate to phosphenylpyruvate, that costs us energy in the form of GTP. And when we turn 3-phosphoglycerate to 1,3-biphosphoglyrate, that costs us energy in the form of ATP. So we've just wasted 3 energy molecules. But in actual fact, remember, we're taking 2 pyruvate to make 1 glucose. So double that. We're actually wasting 6 ATP. So gluconeogenesis costs us 6 ATP. Now, the reason why I have to highlight that is because the body does not conserve functions that cost a lot of energy if it can get rid of it, right? Now, the body has kept this because it's important. Gluconeogenesis is important. Maintaining normal resting blood glucose is important because there's structures like the brain and the retina and other tissues that really rely heavily on glucose. Now, there will be other people saying ketones are better sources of energy. Ketones are backup energy sources. And one of the reasons why we know this is because the liver and the body try so hard, it wastes energy just to try and maintain our resting blood glucose levels, okay? So, I'm not saying you can't use ketones as an energy source for the brain, but I'm saying glucose is a preferred energy source. All right, so it's waste energy, but we're in a fasted state, right? We've had no food. Where the hell are we getting this energy from? The fatty acids. So if you've got even chain fatty acids, they can enter the mitochondria and turn into acetyl-CoA. But can you see a problem here? The problem is this, right? Fatty acids are turning into acetyl-CoA. So our acetyl-CoA levels are going through the roof. But look, oxaloacetate is effectively leaving. It's turning to malate and leaving. So our oxaloacetate levels are going through the floor. So remember, you need acetyl-CoA is a 2-carbon molecule, oxaloacetate is a 4, and it turns a 6-carbon citrate molecule. But if acetyl-CoA goes up, but that goes down, acetyl-CoA can't enter the Krebs cycle. So what happens then if acetyl-CoA can't enter the Krebs cycle? Well, something needs to happen with it. Firstly, when acetyl-CoA levels go up, that is a stimulator to create pyruvate carboxylase. That makes sense. It says, hey, I'm creating so much of me, pyruvate, don't turn into me, go somewhere else. So that's one thing. Second thing is this. What happens is acetyl-CoA snaps together like Lego blocks to form what we were just talking about before, ketone bodies. Now, example of ketone bodies are beta hydroxybutyrate. Now, what happens is beta hydroxybutyrate can leave the liver. It leaves the mitochondria, leaves the hepatocyte, leaves the liver, jumps into the bloodstream and travels to the brain. And it can cross the blood-brain barrier easily. The brain sucks up ketones. What does the brain do with the ketones? Well, if we were to imagine that this was now not a hepatocyte, but a neuron, the beta hydroxybutyrate turns back into acetyl-CoA and just re-enters the Krebs cycle. But you might go, wait a minute. The whole problem was we didn't have enough oxaloacetate to bind with acetyl-CoA. Remember I said to you earlier, gluconeogenesis is only happening in the liver. So it's only the liver where the oxaloacetate levels are low, because it's only in the liver that the oxaloacetate is turned into malate to try and re-establish glucose, blood glucose levels. The brain isn't doing this, so the brain has normal oxaloacetate. So if we bring in more ketone bodies to make more acetyl-CoA, the brain's thinking, great, I've got an energy source, and just feeds it into the Krebs cycle to make more ATP. Brilliant. And so what we've got here is an overview. So you might find in an exam question, which of the following are not gluconeogenic substrates? Fatty acids are not, because fatty acids turn to acetyl-CoA, turn into ketone bodies. They don't make glucose. So fatty acids are not a gluconeogenic substrate, but glycerol, amino acids, and lactate are. Okay? You can even make an argument that maybe oxaloacetate could be as well. I'm Dr. Mike. I hope that helps. Hi everyone, Dr. Mike here. If you enjoyed this video, please hit like and subscribe. We've got hundreds of others just like this. If you want to contact us, please do so on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Dr. Mike Todorovic, at DrMiketodorovic. Speak to you soon.